If you're listening by firelight or street lamp, tell me which city you've found these pages in. And if you'd keep walking with me through the older shadows of Faerun, subscribe to the channel. Some knowledge is safest when it's carried carefully, one truth at a time. Before there was any single spell that tried to steal a god's breath, there was a civilization that stopped believing the sky was a limit. Netheril began as a people of harsh ground and harder choices, but it did not remain humble for long. They found ancient arcane principles in the bones of the world and treated them like a ladder. Magic became their answer to distance, hunger, and time itself. And when you solve enough mortal problems with spellcraft, you start to forget you are mortal. The Netherese raised enclaves, cities torn free from gravity and anchored by mythalars, great engines of sustained magic. It was not merely engineering, it was philosophy made visible. The earth below became something you looked down on, and the gods above became something you looked past. That is where the challenge truly begins. Not with rebellion, but with replacement. In Netheril, the most powerful arcanists were called archwizards, and the title was not poetry. They were living institutions. Their research shaped law. Their rivalries shaped geography. Their pride shaped what was considered possible, and possibility has a way of demanding a final proof. Karsus was born into that world like a blade drawn from a forge, brilliant, sharp, and certain that any boundary was simply an unsolved equation. He was not the first Netherese arcanist to be arrogant. He was the first to be arrogant in a way that could end a world. His mind returned again and again to the same quiet, terrifying thought. The source of mortal magic was not merely a set of spells. It was the weave, structured, maintained, and ultimately stewarded by a goddess. Maestral, Lady of Mysteries, was not just a deity worshipped by mages. She was the unseen architecture that made their greatest works stable. Netheril's highest spellcasters understood this in theory. They invoked her name. They offered rites. They argued about her nature in salons and sanctums. But understanding something is not the same as respecting it. For Karsus, the weave was not sacred. It was a system, and systems can be seized. If a city could be lifted with the right foundation, then divinity itself could be worn, briefly, disastrously, like a crown hammered out of raw power. So he began shaping the spell that would later be remembered with the same dread as a plague. Karsus's avatar. It was not a prayer. It was not a bargain. It was an act of arcane theft, designed to wrench the mantle of a god into mortal hands. Even before it was cast, the spell revealed a hidden truth about the realms. The gods are not challenged only by armies or heresies. They are challenged when mortals learn enough to mistake the scaffolding of creation for something that belongs to them. In that age, Netheril did not fall because it was weak. It trembled because it was too strong in the wrong direction. And the most dangerous thing about Karsus was not that he hated the gods. It was that he believed he no longer needed them. Netheril did not feel like a civilization walking toward a cliff. It felt like a civilization discovering how far cliffs could be pushed back. In the enclaves, time itself seemed negotiable. Food could be shaped by spell and storage. Distance could be folded by teleportation circles known only to those powerful enough to pay the price of entry. The old terrors that disciplined earlier peoples, famine, winter, siege, became inconveniences, solvable with enough mastery and enough crystallized will. That comfort did something subtle to the Netherese mind. It did not make them careless in craft. It made them careless in judgment. When every crisis has been reduced to a problem, you begin to treat the divine the same way. Priests still walked their streets, and temples still kept candles, but the deepest reverence in Netheril was reserved for spellbooks, sigils, and those who could carve reality with a word. The archwizards were not merely influential, they were inevitable. Their disputes determined which enclaves rose higher and which rivalries burned hot enough to scorch the land below. And beneath all this glittering ascent, there was a fault line that only a few fully understood. The weave could be stressed. In Netheril's late age, magic had become an industry. Not in the simple sense of widespread cantrips, but in the scale of arcane exertion. Mythalars hummed continuously, holding cities aloft. Great wards drank power day and night, spells of the highest circle, magic so advanced that later eras would forbid or simply fail to replicate it, were researched, refined, and sometimes cast with a confidence that felt like immunity. Karsus moved through this world as both product and predator. He had mentors, rivals, admirers, and critics. Some saw him as Netheril's brightest promise. Others saw in him the kind of intellect that turns on its own civilization like a lightning strike. Brilliant, sudden, and indiscriminate. He did not lack warnings. He simply interpreted them as fear dressed in authority. The mid-truth that began to surface among those closest to the highest spellcraft was this. Maestril's role was not ceremonial. She was the living fulcrum of the weave. Without that stewardship, magic would not merely weaken. It could fail, it could collapse, it could become chaos. Karsus heard this, and it did not frighten him the way it should have. Instead, it clarified the target. If the weave depended on a single divine mind, then Karsus's thinking went a step further. A mortal mind could take that place, at least long enough to shape a better world. One ruled not by distant gods and their inscrutable restraints, but by the genius of Netheril made permanent. This is where the story becomes darker, because it is not only ambition that drives such a spell. It is the belief that the world would be improved by its theft. He designed Karsus's avatar with a precision that bordered on sacrilege. The spell did not seek to merely draw divine power. It sought to assume divine identity, an arcane metamorphosis that would make Karsus, for a moment, what Mistral was. There were other Netherese who chased extremes, some experimenting with immortality, some with monstrous transformations, some with dominions of their own. But Karsus's goal was singular, not to live forever, but to sit where the weave itself was anchored. In the quiet chambers where his calculations spread like a second skin across the walls, the difference between a god and a mage grew thin, paper thin, candle flame thin. And when you reach that point, the world may still look stable, but stability is sometimes only the delay before a collapse. Because one more truth was already waiting, unacknowledged in Karsus's work. Even if a mortal can seize the mantle of a god, the moment of possession is not the moment of control. It is the moment the burden arrives. A spell like Karsus's avatar could not be built in innocence. Every refinement was a decision to keep going. In Netheril's highest circles, there were names spoken with a kind of cautious awe, archwizards whose personal power was so great that they seemed less like citizens and more like weather. Karsus wanted to stand among them, but he also wanted to make them irrelevant, not by killing them, by stepping beyond the entire structure that made rivalry meaningful. He studied the weave the way a surgeon studies the body, not to admire it, but to find the point where it could be opened. There were limits even in Netheril, limits of law, limits of tradition, limits of fear. The most dangerous magic was not always illegal, but it was often kept behind social walls. The moment you admit a thing is possible, you must decide who is allowed to attempt it. Netheryl's archwizards were masters of that kind of gatekeeping, and Karsus did not like gates. So he worked like a man digging beneath a fortress, quietly, methodically, with a patience that contradicted his reputation. The deeper he went, the clearer the stakes became. Mistral was not merely a goddess who granted spells. She was the stabilizing intelligence that allowed magic to function without tearing the world apart. Netheryl's mythalers, its wards, its levitating cities, none of it existed outside her tolerance. That should have been the end of the thought. Instead, it became the justification. In Karsus's mind, Mistral's stewardship was a constraint, a bottleneck. He imagined a weave governed by a mortal intellect, an intellect that did not care about the balance of gods, the slow patience of cosmic order, or the consequences for nations that had never heard of Netheryl. He imagined a weave optimized for Netheryl, and the more he imagined it, the more inevitable it felt. Here is the turning point that many later historians emphasize, because it reframes everything that follows. Karsus did not plan to destroy Mistral out of hatred. He planned to replace her because he believed the weave could be improved. That is a colder kind of defiance than blasphemy. It is the defiance of an engineer who believes the architect is obsolete. The spell's design required a target, a god, a divine identity to seize, and Karsus chose Mistral, the very axis of magic, because no other choice offered the same result. If you could take her mantle, you did not simply become powerful. You became the source through which power was permitted. In the political life of Netheryl, this was more than forbidden. It was destabilizing to the point of suicidal. The archwizards of other enclaves would not tolerate a single mortal becoming the new master of all spellcraft. Even if Karsus claimed benevolent intent, they would hear tyranny in it. The gods would hear theft. The weave itself, if it could be said to hear, would be strained beyond precedent. Yet Netheryl's culture had already trained its greatest minds to mistake warning for weakness. Some among the Netherese did object. There are traditions of remembrance that speak of dissent, of scholars and arcanists who recognized that Mistral's link to magic was not a crown to be worn, but a pillar holding the roof of reality. But their resistance was scattered, and Karsus's momentum was not a debate you could win with caution. Because he had something Netheryl rarely respected enough, a finished plan, and the closer the plan came to completion, the more the world around it began to look like a test waiting to be passed. As though history itself had arranged Netheryl's rise to see whether mortals could reach the divine and survive the touch. Netheryl's enclaves floated serenely in the sky as Karsus prepared his final working. Markets opened. Spells were cast for trivial comfort. Children were born beneath the shadow of mythalers that hummed like a second sun. The tragedy is that the world looked normal right up until the moment it stopped being normal. Because the weave does not announce its breaking point. It simply fails. And when the steward of magic is seized, when Mistral's place is taken for even a breath, the first thing that vanishes is not power. It is control. Karsus did not cast his spell in a battlefield frenzy. He cast it as a culmination, the way a man signs his name at the bottom of a contract he believes the universe is obligated to honor. When Karsus's avatar took hold, it did not announce itself with thunder meant for mortals. It moved through the weave like a hand sliding under a door, silent, precise, and suddenly irreversible. For an instant measured in heartbeats, Karsus became what no Netherese arcanist had ever been, a mortal consciousness grafted onto divine function. That is the first hard truth of the moment. The spell worked, and because it worked, the world learned what Mistral truly was. The weave was not a reservoir you could drain without consequence. It was a living structure held in alignment by a mind vast enough to sustain its contradictions. Millions of spells, countless arcane interactions, and the constant pressure of mortal ambition. When Karsus seized Maestral's mantle, he did not just take power, he took responsibility for every strand at once. The midpoint of the catastrophe was not the fall of a city. It was the brief failure of magic itself. The weave buckled, spells unraveled mid-casting. Enchantments that had been stable for lifetimes flickered like dying lamps. Mythalars, those great engines that kept Netheral's enclaves afloat, depended on the weave's continuity. When that continuity broke, the sky stopped being a sanctuary. Floating cities began to drop, not slowly, not with time for evacuation or prayer. They fell because the principles holding them aloft were no longer being upheld by the one entity who had always upheld them. Mortals on the ground saw the impossible become brutally simple, stone and steel and marble obeying gravity again, without mercy and without negotiation. In that same instant, Karsus discovered the difference between possessing a god's station and understanding it. A mortal mind could touch the mantle of magic, but it could not bear it. Not at that scale. Not against the pressure of an entire world's spellcraft collapsing into a single moment of chaos. Mistral's response was not vengeance in the way mortals imagine it. It was triage. The Lady of Mysteries did what only a god intertwined with magic could do. She sacrificed herself to save the structure of the weave from total annihilation. That act severed Karsus's connection and prevented a collapse that would have been more than a single empire's doom. It would have been the death of magic as the realms understood it. Netheral's fall became the price of the weave's survival. Later ages would remember this as the clearest proof that the gods are not simply rulers sitting above the world. Some of them are load-bearing pillars. Take one away, even for a breath, and everything built atop that support begins to break. Karsus challenged the gods and succeeded for a heartbeat. And in that heartbeat, the realms learned a final, devastating measure of divinity. It is not just power to be seized. It is the burden that keeps reality standing. The fall of Netheral was not a single impact. It was a chain of impacts, each one teaching the same lesson in a new language. Enclaves struck the earth and shattered. Others broke apart in the air, raining ruin across the lands below. The magic that had made daily life effortless became unreliable, then absent, then dangerous. The proud architecture of an empire was reduced to fields of debris and buried vaults that later ages would treat like cursed tombs. And yet the realms did not become a dead world. Because Mistral's sacrifice did not end magic. It reshaped it. The goddess was gone, and in her place rose Mistra, new steward of the weave. New order imposed on what Netheral had nearly broken. The defining shift was not simply a change of divine name, it was a change of rules. The greatest spellcraft of Netheral's age, the kind that reached beyond what later mages would call the ninth circle, became impossible. Not just socially forbidden, but structurally prevented by the way magic was allowed to function. In one act, the weave was made safer for the world and narrower for those who would dominate it. That is the cruel irony. Netheral's greatest triumph, the mastery to build an empire in the sky, became the reason the entire arcane future was bound with limits. The greatest mages of later ages would inherit a weave designed specifically to prevent another Karsus. This is where the story stops being about a single archwizard and becomes about memory. After the catastrophe, surviving Netherese did not all die. Some enclaves fell into obscurity. Some survivors fled, their bloodlines and fragmentary lore scattering across Faerun. Others clung to remnants of power in hidden enclaves, diminished and haunted. Netheril ceased to be a reigning empire, but it did not cease to be a presence. Because ruins have gravity of their own. In the centuries that followed, Netheril became a myth with teeth. To some, it was a cautionary tale told by priests and cautious mages, proof that the gods cannot be safely confronted with mortal arrogance. To others, it was a challenge unfinished, a lost golden age whose secrets had been stolen by divine fear. The mid-truth that settles in here and changes how you understand the catastrophe is that the gods did not win in a simple sense. The gods survived. The world survived. But the cost was paid by mortals. Millions who never touched Karsus's spellbook, who never sat in his sanctum, who simply lived beneath the shadow of floating cities and trusted that the sky would keep holding. Netheril's arrogance was not contained within its archwizards. It was distributed through its society. The survivors carried trauma as much as lore. Some turned to faith, suddenly aware of the invisible supports they had mocked. Others turned inward, convinced that the only mistake was not ambition, but execution, believing that Karsus failed because he was alone, because he was rushed, because he chose the wrong moment, because he did not prepare his mind to bear the mantle. Those are not the thoughts of a civilization that has learned humility. They are the thoughts of a civilization that has learned patience. And so, in the long shadow of Netheril's collapse, the realms gained something more dangerous than an empire, an enduring idea. That mortal magic, properly refined, might still rival divinity, if it could only find a method that did not break the weave. The gods had not only been challenged, they had been studied. And deep in the scattered remnants of Netheril's legacy, some archmages began to pursue a quieter form of defiance, one that did not announce itself with a single world-breaking spell, but with centuries of preparation, secrecy, and unnatural endurance. Netheril's ruin should have been an ending. Instead, it became a filter. The loud kind of ambition died in the cratered fields where enclaves struck the earth. What endured was quieter, shrewder, more patient, and far harder to kill. In the generations after Karsus, the most dangerous Netherese minds stopped trying to seize divinity in a single motion. They began chasing something that could survive long enough to try again. That first shift is the true inheritance of the fall. Not humility, but strategy. Mystra's new laws narrowed the height mortals could climb through spellcraft. The upper reaches of Netherese magic, the kind that had treated the world like clay, were no longer reachable in the same way. For many wizards, that would have been the end of the dream. For Netherese survivors, it became a different problem to solve. If the weave would not allow another Karsus, then the path forward was not higher spells. It was time. Centuries to study every seam of the new order. Millennia to collect what others lost. An existence long enough that gods, empires, and even magical paradigms might change again. That is why undeath begins to dominate the Netherese afterimage. Ulam stands at the center of this transformation, like a monument half buried in the earth. In Netheril's height, he was counted among its mightiest archwizards, so potent that later lore remembers him not simply as a man, but as a force that helped define what Netheril could do. The reveal that matters is not merely that Ulam survived Netheril's end in some form, but how. He pursued undeath and the deep preservation of arcane knowledge. refusing the natural conclusion of mortality in a world where his civilization had already proved that death could be postponed by power. Around the middle of this story, the stakes sharpen. Ulium's legacy is not a single spell or a single enclave. It is the concept that the greatest threat to divine order is not a mortal who tries once, but a mind that refuses to ever stop trying. When the Weave's rules changed, Ulium's response was not surrender. It was adaptation, carried forward beneath the surface of the world, beyond the reach of ordinary kingdoms and ordinary historians. Then there is Larlock, often named the Shadow King, whose very existence reads like an answer to Karsus written in cold ink. Where Karsus challenged the gods openly and catastrophically, Larlock challenged the gods by outlasting their moment. A Netherese arcanist who embraced lichdom, he withdrew into hidden strongholds and gathered power the way an ancient dragon gathers treasure. Slowly, obsessively, and with the confidence that time itself would do half the work. The crucial truth about Larlock is that he did not need to win in public to be dangerous. He amassed lore, artifacts, and influence through servants, alliances, and bindings that stretched across eras. His defiance was not a single blasphemous spell. It was the creation of a private empire of magic that could endure while the surface world forgot what Netheril had been. Together, figures like Iulam and Larlock reveal what Netheril became after it died. Not a nation, but a subterranean tradition of will. They did not claim godhood. They did something more corrosive to divine certainty. They proved that a mortal who cannot safely seize a god's mantle can still undermine the god's advantage by refusing to vanish from history at all. Netheril did not return as a memory. It returned as a city. Long after the enclaves fell and the name Karsus became a warning spoken with a lowered voice, one enclave endured in a way the world did not anticipate. It did not survive by resisting the fall through greater spellcraft. It survived by leaving the world behind, slipping into the plane of shadow, where time and certainty feel thinner, and where forgotten things can learn new shapes. When that enclave came back, it called itself Shade, and its people were the Shadowvar, Netherese heirs who had not merely preserved their ancestry, but refined its bitterness. They returned with the old hunger intact and a new patronage woven into it. Shar, mistress of loss and shadow, whose doctrine was not creation but subtraction. Where Mistra's weave demanded balance, Shar offered an alternative current of power, shadowed, secretive, and willing to reward those who hated the limits placed on mortal magic. This is the pivot that changes how you should understand Netheril's second rise. The Shadowvar were not just rebuilding an empire. They were rebuilding an argument. They looked at Netheril's fall and concluded that the lesson was not never challenge the gods, but choose the right god to challenge the others. Under rulers such as Telemont Tanthul, Shade pursued a restoration that was both political and metaphysical. They returned to Anorok, the ancient heartland of Netheril, and treated the desert itself as a wound in history that could be reversed. They raised power through hidden pacts, shadow-forged magic, and the cold continuity of a people who believed they had been robbed of their rightful place. To the outside world, this was a nightmare in slow motion, an empire believed dead, returning not as a fractured diaspora, but as a coherent force with a floating city and a disciplined purpose. Yet the most unsettling truth was subtler than military threat. It was the way their existence reopened an old question Maestra's reforms were meant to bury. If the highest expressions of Netherese spellcraft had been curtailed, then how could Netheril rise again? The answer lay in shadows. The Shadowvar did not simply pursue the same road as Karsus. They pursued a parallel road that existed because Shar desired it. Their magic was not a direct violation of Mistra's order so much as a bypass, an attempt to claim supremacy by shifting the ground under the contest. They made defiance collaborative, mortal ambition bound to divine resentment, and for a time, it worked well enough to terrify the realms. But the story of Shade also carries the same structural weight as the first Netheril, because the cost of such power is never paid only by those who wield it. A nation tethered to shadow is still tethered, to a goddess whose essence is loss, to a philosophy that consumes as it empowers. The Shadowvar could raise a city, but they could not escape the nature of the bargain that kept it aloft. Netheril's return proved something many preferred not to admit. The fall of an empire does not end its ambition. It only changes its methods. The challenge to the gods did not die with Karsus. It learned how to hide, how to pray to darkness, and how to come back wearing a new kind of faith. If Netheril's first sin was believing magic could replace the gods, later ages proved a colder variant. Magic could root around them. Thay is where that idea hardened into policy. The Red Wizards were never a loose cabal of scholars. They were a state built on arcane hierarchy, where spellcasting was not a vocation, but a mechanism of rule. In such a place, faith does not vanish, but it becomes subordinate, tolerated only so long as it does not compete with the will of those who command the towers. And when Sas-Tam rose to dominance, Thay's defiance took on its most explicit, most necromantic form. He did not cast a single spell meant to seize a divine mantle in a heartbeat. He built permanence, an apparatus of undeath, enforcement, and ritual geometry that treated the living population as fuel and the nation itself as a spell component. His projects were not simply more power, but a structural challenge to the gods' oldest leverage over mortals: death, fear, and the promise of an afterlife. A realm where the dead rise by command and obedience is extracted from corpses is a realm where the gods of judgment and mercy find fewer souls reaching them intact. That is the mid-part anchor Thay reveals. A mage does not have to strike at a god directly to injure what a god feeds upon. Undeath is not only a personal escape from mortality. In the hands of a tyrant lich, it becomes an attempted redesign of the moral economy of the world. Other archmages reached for similar godlike outcomes through different engines. Manshun's legacy, sprawling, ruthless, and fractured across time, shows how ambition can imitate divinity through control rather than worship. Influence networks, mercenary force, and secret spellcraft can create a shadow sovereignty that functions like a competing providence. Protection for the obedient, punishment for the defiant, and a constant sense that an unseen hand is steering outcomes. It is not godhood, but it borrows the shape of it. Even the greatest mythals and wards of later eras carry this echo. Grand workings meant to bind territories, enforce laws of reality within borders, and make a ruler's will feel inevitable. The gods govern the wide cosmos. The archmage tries to govern a zone so absolute, it resembles a private universe. And this is how the challenge to the gods persisted after Netheril, less like a duel, more like an infection. The most dangerous mages learned to stop asking, "How do I take a god's power?" and began asking, "How do I make the world behave as though the gods are optional?" Netheril fell in an instant. Thay endures by design. Different methods, same rebellion. An attempt to turn the sacred into something administrated, quantified, and owned. In the end, the realms do not fear the mage who shouts at the heavens. They fear the mage who builds a kingdom where the heavens no longer matter. Netheryl's ruin taught the realms that the weave could be strained. Later ages learned something worse. It could be wounded. When the gods themselves were forced into mortal form during the time of troubles in 1358, divinity stopped feeling distant. Temples saw their patrons bleed. Kings and beggars alike learned that a god could be cornered, bargained with, even killed, and that the world would pay for it immediately. Magic did not politely diminish. It misfired, surged, failed, and turned treacherous in the hands of those who had always trusted it. The pivotal fact is this: Maestra fell, and the weave convulsed with her. The lesson was not theological, it was mechanical. The realms witnessed in public what Netheril had learned in catastrophe. When the steward of magic is removed, the structure does not remain stable out of habit. For a generation of archmages, that revelation changed the nature of ambition. The gods were no longer eternal abstractions. They were power centers with vulnerabilities, not easily exploited, but real. A mortal could now imagine strategies that were previously unthinkable, not because they were wiser than Karsus, but because history had shown the impossible could happen again. Then came the second great wound. 1385 DR, when Mystra was destroyed once more, and the spell plague tore through Toril. This was not merely wild magic or localized disaster. It was a world-scale collapse of magical reliability. Blue fire, broken spells, shattered wards, and civilizations forced to adapt in real time, while the laws beneath them rewrote themselves. Here the story tightens into a hard, unsettling hinge. The gods were not just challenged by mages. The gods were being displaced by events, by divine conflict, by cosmic upheaval that mortals could neither control nor fully predict. In such a climate, the ancient dream of challenging the gods stops sounding like hubris to some ears. It starts sounding like risk management. If the weave can be broken by divine war, then mortals will try to build anchors that do not depend on divine stability, even if those anchors are ugly. Scholars disagree on how much of this was mortal opportunity and how much was mortal delusion. One reading treats these ages as proof that the cosmos will always correct any attempt to steal divine function, no matter the method. Another insists the opposite, that each fracture in the weave proved the gods are part of the same vulnerable machinery as everything else, and that mortals who survive long enough may eventually learn to exploit the seams. Either way, the consequences converge on the same truth. Netheril's sin was not unique. It was simply early. The realms did not become safer after Karsus. They became more educated in what divinity costs, and more tempted to believe the cost can be paid by someone else. By the end of this long thread, Netheril's ascent, Karsus's theft, Maestral's sacrifice, Maestra's reforms, the shadowed returns and later wounds of the weave. The truth is no longer hidden. The gods of the Forgotten Realms are not distant monarchs ruling from unreachable thrones. Some are structural, some are parasitic, some are both. And mortals, in every age, keep discovering the same fatal temptation. If the divine is part of the world's machinery, then perhaps the machinery can be owned. Netheril was the first great proof of what that idea demands. Karsus did not fail because he lacked power. He failed because he mistook possession for comprehension. For a moment, the spell made him the axis of magic, and in that moment, the entire world's spellcraft pressed against a mortal mind like an ocean against glass. Mistral's death was not merely tragedy, it was a divine emergency measure. an act that saved the weave by accepting the fall of an empire as collateral. Maestra's response, limiting mortal spellcraft, was not punishment. It was structural reinforcement. A new design meant to keep the world from ever again balancing on a single mortal's arrogance. Yet the ages that followed proved why this can never be a clean solution. If you narrow the heights, the ambitious do not stop climbing. They change the rock face. Larlock chose endurance. Uliam pursued preservation beyond mortality. Shade sought a bypass through shadow and Shar's favor. They attempted to domesticate death itself into a political tool. And when the time of troubles and the spell plague shook the realms, even cautious minds were forced to admit that divine stability is not guaranteed. So what did the mages who challenged the gods truly accomplish? They revealed the realm's hidden architecture. The weave is not just a gift, it is a restraint. Divinity is not just power, it is obligation. And the world survives only because those obligations are carried, sometimes by beings who can die, and sometimes by systems that can break. That is the weight of the final lesson, and it is heavier than any moral warning. The greatest mortal hubris is not believing you can reach the gods. Mortals reach them again and again, through prayer, through prophecy, through artifacts, through spells, through catastrophe. The hubris is believing that if you reach high enough, you will find freedom. Netheril reached the heavens and found gravity waiting. It found the truth that the gods do not simply hoard power out of jealousy. Some of that power is a load-bearing function, and when a mortal tries to steal it, the world does not argue. It falls. And that is why the story endures in every wizard's library and every temple's warning, even when names change and empires rise in new forms. The challenge to the gods is not rare. It is a recurring impulse in a world where magic exists. But Karsus's shadow remains the clearest inscription on the edge of that impulse, carved into history like a scar. The divine can be touched, but it cannot be safely worn.